The silence in our Manhattan apartment carried a physical weight. It was never peace. It was the cold, curated hush of a museum gallery, where every object is locked behind glass, meant only to be looked at, never held or lived in. For 5 years, my marriage had been a perfect, suffocating masterpiece of that very silence. My husband, a man whose presence was rarely felt beyond the expensive cologne clinging to a suit jacket draped over a dining chair, spoke only in transactional demands and clipped, dismissive remarks. His cold indifference was a form of architecture, erecting invisible walls through our open-plan home until I felt trapped in a maze I'd been too afraid to name. My only friend, who had watched the light in my eyes fade to a flicker over those 5 years, finally stopped holding back. She didn't waste time on empty platitudes about marriage or patience. She booked a 10-session pass at a yoga studio in the West Village, sent the confirmation straight to my inbox, and followed up with a single line. Go. Just breathe in a room that isn't designed to shrink you for 1 hour. The thought of stepping into that studio filled me with a familiar, gnawing dread. A room full of strangers, bodies moving in synchronized rhythm, while I, clumsy, numb, and completely disconnected from my own body after years of shrinking myself, would surely fumble and fall. My husband already treated any activity outside our rigid, curated social obligations as an act of betrayal. He tracked my whereabouts, demanded receipts for every purchase, and interrogated me for hours if I so much as stopped for coffee on my way home. A single yoga class felt like a declaration of war I had no strength to fight. Still, that confirmation email sat in my inbox, a tiny, unignorable beacon of defiance. I went, if only to prove to my friend that I'd tried to reach for the lifeline she'd thrown me. The studio wrapped around me like a warm blanket the second I stepped inside. It smelled of sandalwood, eucalyptus, and the faint, clean scent of movement. Nothing like the sterile, lemon-scented sterility of my apartment, where even the air felt filtered and controlled. Women of every body type, age, and background unrolled their mats, their quiet chatter a soft, welcoming hum that felt nothing like the sharp, performative small talk of my husband's dinner parties. I slipped into the darkest corner of the back row, clinging to the wall like a refugee seeking shelter from scrutiny. Then she walked to the front of the room, and every eye in the studio turned to her, including mine. She was the instructor. Her dark hair was pulled back into a thick, high ponytail that swayed with every deliberate step. Dressed in simple black leggings and a plain tank top, her frame was a masterclass in controlled, intentional strength. There was a quiet, unshakable calm in every movement she made, a confidence that felt equal parts intimidating and deeply, achingly enviable. Mid-class, as I fumbled to twist my body into a passable downward-facing dog, a shadow fell across my mat. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was her. She knelt beside me, keeping a respectful distance, her voice a low, calm murmur that only I could hear. "Would you like a hand with your alignment? It will help release the tension in your back," she said, waiting for my hesitant, almost imperceptible nod before moving closer. With a professional, deliberate touch, she placed one hand lightly on my lower back to guide the proper tilt of my hips, and the other along the upper edge of my shoulder blades, cueing me to draw them down away from my ears. "Let your heels sink toward the floor, as much as feels comfortable for you," she said. A sharp, sickening jolt shot through me. It had nothing to do with her touch itself, which was respectful and strictly instructional. It was the narrative my mind immediately forced onto it, fueled by years of my husband's poison. His voice echoed in my head, a constant litany of suspicion, that any time I was out of his sight, I was hiding something, meeting someone, making a fool of him. In that split second, I didn't see a yoga instructor offering guidance. I saw a potential informant.
A spy.
Someone who would witness my weakness, report it back to him, and twist it into another failure I'd be forced to atone for. I flinched hard, yanking my body back into a tight, defensive ball. "I've got it," I mumbled, my face burning with a shame I couldn't name. She immediately pulled her hands back, holding them up in a calm, non-threatening gesture of surrender, a small, neutral smile on her face, before quietly moving on to the next student. My initial fear curdled into a quiet, burning suspicion. I began to watch her, not as a student watches a teacher, but as a detective watches a prime suspect. Every easy smile she offered a classmate, every quiet word of encouragement, felt like a carefully crafted performance. I spun wild, paranoid fantasies, her meeting my husband for a discreet coffee, trading details about my vulnerability for a generous donation to her studio, or a coveted introduction to a circle of wealthy, influential contacts. That paranoia became a fortress I built around myself, brick by painstaking brick. I made sure I was the last person to slip into the studio seconds before class started, and the first to bolt out the door the second it ended. When she walked the room during practice, her bare feet silent on the warm wood floor, I'd fix my gaze on a single floorboard, willing myself to disappear. I learned to mimic the poses only by watching the woman in front of me, flatly refusing to make eye contact or accept any direct guidance. My body stayed stiff, unyielding, a physical manifestation of the walls I'd thrown up. I considered quitting 100 times, tearing up the pass my friend had bought me, but the thought of returning to the suffocating, 24/7 silence of my apartment was even more terrifying. The studio, for all the threats I'd imagined in it, was at least a prison with a different view. One Tuesday evening, the invisible walls of my home turned solid, closing in on me until I could barely breathe. My husband was enraged by a tiny social misstep. At a dinner party with his business partners, I'd spoken out of turn, offering a measured opinion on a local political issue. He'd smiled through the rest of the night, but the second we walked through the front door, he unleashed a torrent of calculated, cutting cruelty. His voice never rose, but every word was a blade, honed to slice straight through the softest, most vulnerable parts of me. He called me embarrassing, ungrateful, stupid. He told me no one would ever care about my opinions, that I was nothing more than an accessory to his life, and that I'd be homeless without him. He froze my access to our joint bank accounts, took my house keys, and left me locked in the living room while he retired to his home office. I waited until I heard his office door click shut, then climbed out the fire escape of our 12th floor apartment, my shoes in my hand, my wallet with a handful of cash tucked into my pocket. I had nowhere else to go. I walked 40 blocks in the cold autumn air, straight to the studio. It was empty when I arrived, the main practice room dark and quiet. I slipped into the empty locker room, collapsed onto a wooden bench, and the tight, suffocating knot in my chest finally burst, unleashing a storm of silent, body-racking sobs. I didn't hear her come in. The first sign of her presence was a tissue box, set gently down on the bench in front of me. I looked up, my vision blurred with tears. She stood by the small counter in the corner, not staring, not prying, just quietly busying herself with the electric kettle. She didn't ask what was wrong. She didn't say a single word. A few minutes later, she set a steaming mug in my hands. The warm scent of ginger and honey wrapped around me, a tiny, steady anchor in the chaos of my grief. She sat down on the far end of the bench, leaving an ocean of space between us, and simply waited. The silence in that room was nothing like the silence of my apartment. It wasn't heavy with unspoken judgment or threat. It was soft, open, a space held just for me, to fill if and when I chose. When my sobs finally eased into shaky, ragged breaths, she spoke, her voice calm and steady, her gaze fixed on the lockers across the room. "My ex-husband," she said, her tone flat, like she was stating a fact she'd long since made peace with, "used to lock me in the windowless pantry under our stairs for hours, every time I embarrassed him in public." The words hung in the air, so shocking in their quiet delivery that they seemed to suck all the oxygen from the room. I stared at her, at this woman who seemed the very definition of unshakable strength and self-possession, and felt my breath catch. "It was never about the pantry," she continued, her voice still steady. "It was about the silence, about making me feel so small, so insignificant, that the world outside that door stopped existing. He spent years convincing me I was nothing, that I had no value, no voice, no right to take up space, unless he gave me permission." She turned her head then, and for the first time, I saw past the serene, confident instructor. I saw the flicker of the woman she'd been, a woman who'd known the exact same suffocating pain I was living through. Yoga didn't just help me reconnect with my body. It gave me a room of my own, a space where my breath, my needs, my voice were the only things that mattered. I opened the studio because I know exactly what it feels like to be desperate for a safe room, a place where you don't have to shrink yourself to survive. In that moment, the entire paranoid narrative I'd built around her, the suspicions, the fear, the walls I'd thrown up, crumbled into dust. She wasn't a threat. She was a survivor. She hadn't seen a clumsy, awkward student hiding in the back row. She'd seen a woman gasping for air and had been trying, in her quiet, gentle way, to throw me a life raft. The dam broke. Every word I'd swallowed for 5 years poured out of me in a ragged, unstopping torrent. I told her about the suffocating loneliness of my marriage, the way my husband used silence and control as weapons, the constant, gnawing anxiety that I was always one wrong word, one wrong look, away from his rage and disapproval. I spoke of the gilded cage I lived in, of the friends and acquaintances who saw the perfect apartment, the perfect clothes, the perfect marriage, but never noticed the iron bars locking me inside. I told her everything. She listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't offer empty platitudes or easy fixes. She just sat there, her presence a steady, unshakable pillar, and listened. When I finally fell silent, exhausted and hollowed out, she spoke. "You are not small," she said, the word simple, but landing with the force of a revelation. "You've just been forced to live in a room with a very low ceiling." From that day on, everything changed. My practice on the mat transformed completely. Her guidance and adjustments were no longer intrusions to fear, but acts of support to lean into. I learned to breathe deeply, to root my feet to the earth, to find strength in muscles I'd let go dormant for years. As my body grew stronger and more open, so did my spirit. I stopped hiding in the dark corner of the back row and moved to the center of the room. I began to take up space. I began to believe I deserved to. One evening, as we were locking up the studio, I spotted a thick certified letter sitting on her front desk. It was a formal zoning complaint, dense with impenetrable legalese and veiled threats. A luxury developer had purchased the adjacent building and was claiming the studio's fire exit access violated a brand new, obscure city ordinance, a transparent pretext to force her out so they could demolish the space and expand their high-end condo development. For a split second, her usual calm facade cracked. I saw the flash of fear in her eyes, the terror of losing the sanctuary she'd fought so hard to build, the safe space that had saved both of us. In that moment, a part of me that had been dormant for 5 years snapped back into place. Before my marriage, I had been a lawyer, a formidable, top-rated corporate litigator. I'd graduated at the very top of my class at Columbia Law, won a string of high-profile cases against some of the biggest developers in the city, and built a reputation as a lawyer who never backed down from a fight. I'd walked away from it all to play the role of the quiet, obedient, perfect wife my husband demanded. "Let me see that," I said, my voice sharp, steady, and unshakable, the voice I hadn't used in half a decade. She hesitated for only a second, then slid the documents across the desk. As I read, the familiar language, the strategic loopholes, the classic bullying tactics of corporate overreach, all of it came rushing back to me, like I'd never stepped away from the courtroom. This wasn't just a complaint letter. It was an act of war. And for the first time in 5 years, I felt a white-hot surge of purpose. She had given me a sanctuary to heal my spirit. Now, I would build an impenetrable legal fortress around hers. The dusty corners of my mind, stuffed with case law, procedural statutes, and years of litigation strategy, lit up like a switch had been flipped. I spent my days buried in the Columbia Law Library, digging up precedent after precedent to dismantle the developer's case. I spent my nights at the studio with her, spreading out blueprints, city ordinances, and building codes across the polished wood floor. We worked side by side, fueled by endless coffee and a shared, unshakable determination. I walked her through parsing the developer's threats, drafting countermotions, and documenting every single instance of harassment from their contractors, who'd taken to loitering outside the studio and intimidating members as they arrived. Our bond solidified in those late nights, surrounded by piles of paper and legal filings. We didn't dwell on our pasts anymore. We were focused on the present, on the fight. I saw a new side of her, a sharp, shrewd businesswoman with meticulous records, a fierce love for her community, and an iron will. And she saw a side of me that had been buried for 5 years. Relentless, razor-sharp legal strategist, unafraid to go toe-to-toe with the biggest names in New York real estate. I wasn't my husband's wife. I wasn't a scared student hiding in the back row. I was a lawyer, and I was protecting my friend. It felt less like repaying a debt, and more like reclaiming the power I'd given away years before. The inevitable explosion came on a Thursday evening mid-class. My husband, who discovered my frequent trips to the law library, my hidden legal files, and my plan to file for divorce, had tracked me to the studio. The heavy front door slammed open in the middle of the practice, letting in a frigid blast of New York winter air. He stood in the doorway, his face a mask of cold, unbridled fury, his tailored expensive suit looking grotesquely out of place in the warm, serene studio. "So this is it," he said, his voice dangerously low, cutting straight through the soft music. "You've been hiding out in this dump. With her." His cold, dismissive eyes swept over the instructor, then locked onto me. "We're going home. Now." The 20 other women in the room froze, their bodies tensed mid-pose. I felt the old, familiar paralysis creep up my spine, my muscles turning to ice. He took a step forward, his hand outstretched, ready to grab my arm and drag me out the door, exactly what he'd done so many times before at parties, at dinners, at events where I'd embarrassed him. He expected me to fold, to shrink, to obey. For a split second I almost did, but then something shifted. She moved. With the same fluid, deliberate grace she brought to her practice, she stepped off her platform and planted herself directly between me and my husband. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't make a single aggressive move. She just stood there, her posture relaxed but completely immovable, a human shield between me and the man who'd spent 5 years breaking me down. She was inches shorter than him, but in that moment, she seemed to tower over the entire room. He faltered, his hand dropping to his side. He was a man who'd spent his entire life intimidating women into submission, and he had no idea what to do with one who simply refused to back down. "You need to leave this property immediately," she said, her voice perfectly calm, but carrying an unshakable authority that filled every corner of the studio. "You are trespassing on private business property, and you are disrupting my class." "This is a private marital matter," he snarled, trying to regain control of the room. "You are trespassing in a private business, and you are menacing a member of this community," I heard myself say. The voice was mine, but it was the voice I hadn't used in 5 years. Sharp, steady, unflinching, the voice of a litigator who knew exactly what she was doing. Bolstered by her presence in front of me, I stood up straight, my legs firm beneath me, despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "If you do not leave this premises in the next 30 seconds, we will call the police and file formal trespassing and harassment charges. Every woman in this room is a witness to your behavior." My husband stared at me, then at her, his face twisted with pure, stunned disbelief. He'd lost control of the narrative. He'd lost control of me.
And he knew it.
He turned on his heel and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. The sound echoed through the sudden, absolute silence of the room. The storm had broken, but I was not left drowning in a wreckage. That incident, witnessed by 20 women who all volunteered sworn statements, became the unshakable cornerstone of my case. With her help, I moved out of that apartment that very night, taking nothing but a small duffel bag of clothes and the legal files I'd spent months assembling. She gave me the spare room above the studio, a small, simple space with a bed, a desk, and a window that looked out over the West Village streets. It felt more like home than the opulent, gilded cage I'd just escaped ever had. From that safe harbor, I waged my war. I filed for divorce first thing the next morning. I used the studio incident, backed by dozens of witness statements, to obtain an immediate temporary restraining order against my husband. Every dismissive email, every recorded instance of his financial control, every documented incident of verbal and emotional abuse became another exhibit in my case. She was there through every step of it, not offering legal advice, but providing the steady, grounding presence I so desperately needed. She made sure I ate when I was too stressed to remember, sat with me in silence when the emotional toll became too heavy to bear, and reminded me to breathe when I felt like I was drowning. She was the anchor that let me be the storm. Just as my divorce was nearing its final stages, a new, insidious threat emerged. An anonymous complaint was filed with the city's Department of Buildings and Licensing, alleging the studio was operating with invalid insurance, improper safety certifications, and unlicensed instructors. It was a meticulously crafted attack, designed to bury her in a mountain of bureaucracy, crippling fines, and a forced shutdown. We both knew exactly who was behind it. It was my husband's final, petty parting shot, a way to hurt me by destroying the sanctuary that had saved me. A cold, unyielding rage settled in my chest. This was no longer just my fight for freedom. It was a fight to protect the space that had become a lifeline for so many women, including both of us. I dove into the city's labyrinthine business and licensing codes with a ferocity I hadn't known I possessed. After weeks of digging, I uncovered that the complaint had been fast-tracked through the system by a city clerk who was later revealed to be the first cousin of my husband's lead business associate. I filed a formal grievance exposing the blatant conflict of interest, systematically presented every single piece of the studio's flawless, up-to-date paperwork to the licensing board, and filed a counter-complaint for malicious prosecution against the parties involved. I didn't just defend the studio. I went on the offensive, ensuring the fraudulent complaint was struck from the record entirely, and that every individual who'd participated in the scheme was formally investigated by the city's ethics board. We won. On every single front. My divorce was finalized, granting me a generous settlement that ensured my complete, lifelong financial independence, no strings attached. The studio was fully cleared of all fraudulent charges, its reputation not just intact, but strengthened by the outpouring of support from the community. But the experience had irrevocably changed both of us. We realized the studio could be so much more than just a place to practice yoga. It could be the safe haven we'd both needed for every woman who felt trapped and alone. Using my legal expertise and her radical, compassionate vision, we restructured the studio into a registered nonprofit organization. The revenue from yoga classes would fund our core mission, providing free, trauma-informed yoga classes, emergency temporary housing, and pro bono legal counsel for women escaping abusive and controlling situations. The small room above the studio, my first refuge when I'd escaped my husband, became the first of our emergency housing units, a temporary safe haven for women in transition. The space was reborn, a physical manifestation of our partnership, a sanctuary for the body and mind, built by her, and a fortress of legal protection and advocacy, built by me. Months slipped by. The city turned from the crisp, golden glow of autumn to the deep, quiet hush of winter. One night, after a long day of client meetings, legal filings, and back-to-back classes, we sat together on the floor of the empty studio, the room lit only by the soft glow of the streetlights filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. We sipped the same ginger and honey tea she'd handed me that day in the locker room, when I'd had nothing left but tears. We didn't need to talk about how far we'd come. The silence between us was no longer empty or heavy. It was full, rich, and warm, woven from a shared history of battles fought and won, of wounds healed, of strength reclaimed. I looked at her, at the quiet, unshakable strength in her profile, and felt a wave of gratitude, so profound it brought tears to my eyes. We were two women from completely different worlds, who'd found each other by chance in the middle of our darkest moments. She taught me to reconnect with my body, and in doing so, had given me the courage to reclaim my life. I, in turn, had used the voice my husband had tried to silence, to protect the sanctuary she'd built. "Thank you," I said softly, into the quiet. She just nodded, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. She understood every single thing those two words held. My life now bears no resemblance to the one I lived just a year before. I am the lead counsel for our foundation, spending my days fighting for women who've been told they have no voice, no power, no right to take up space. Her studio has become a beloved beacon across New York City, a place where women come not just to stretch their bodies, but to find their strength, their community, and their way back to themselves. We are partners. We are friends. We are family, forged in crisis and bound by purpose. Sometimes I stand at the back of a packed class and watch her teach. I watch her move with that same calm, unshakable authority that once intimidated me, and I see her for exactly who she is, a lighthouse, cutting through the dark for every woman who's ever felt lost at sea. And I am no longer a ship drowning in the storm. I am the architect of the harbor. Our story doesn't have an end. It is a continuous, unfolding testament to the quiet, unyielding power that is ignited when one woman looks at another and, instead of walking away, chooses to stand as a shield, to hold up a mirror, and to keep the light burning bright.